I never thought a snowstorm could bring out the worst in people, or the best in me. The flakes were falling hard that morning, a white fury covering every inch of my driveway. And yet, there she was. Karen, my so-called neighbor, my HOA nightmare, the woman who seemed to believe the world bent around her whims. She didn't just intrude, she took my space like it was hers by birthright, like I was invisible. I had spent hours clearing my spot, pushing through ice and wind until my fingers were numb, my back screaming. And then I turned around, and there she was, that sharp blonde bob catching the gray light, cold, commanding eyes drilling me like I was some minor inconvenience, perfectly pressed red pantsuit gleaming in the snow. I froze. Not because I was afraid, but because I was trying to calculate. Every instinct I had told me to call the HOA, scream, do something official. But I knew better. I had seen how they cowered before her, bending rules to avoid confrontation. I wasn't going to let her ruin my morning or my dignity. I took a deep breath, letting my weary yet determined gaze sweep over the scene. My scuffed loafers sank into the snow as I stepped closer, careful not to slip, careful not to give her any hint that I was rattled. She looked at me with that rigid, authoritative posture, the crisp white shirt under her red suit practically daring me to speak. "Morning," I said flatly, my voice steady despite the cold. She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I needed a spot. You wouldn't mind, would you?" I wanted to laugh, wanted to scream, wanted to storm inside and grab a shovel like some hero in a cheesy movie, but instead I let my mind work. This was the moment where patience turned into power. I wasn't going to fight her the way everyone else did. I wasn't going to bend or plead or call in rules enforcement. I was going to let her arrogance build her own trap. The next few hours were a blur of snow, planning, and silent fury. I cleared my spot again, extra wide this time, leaving no question where my car would go. I left subtle reminders, a cone here, a small pile of snow just off center, tiny psychological nudges she wouldn't notice consciously, but that would make her overstep. And overstep she did. By noon, she was back, tires crunching over fresh snow, eyes scanning, lips pressing into that perfect line of entitlement. She parked smack in the center of my hard work, laughing softly to herself as if I didn't exist. That's when I made my decision. I would not let this slide. Not today, not in a blizzard where her own arrogance would be her undoing. I went back inside, heart pounding, and pulled out my phone. But not to call the HOA, not to file a complaint. I called the towing service I had scouted weeks earlier, one with a reputation for speed, discretion, and willingness to play along when reason met stubbornness. I explained the situation in precise terms, emphasizing timing. "She's there now, and she won't move. Can you get her before the storm traps her?" The operator paused, then confirmed. "We'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. That's all I had. 20 minutes for snow, wind, and a Karen to become the unwitting star of her own humiliation. I stood by the window, hands pressed against the cold glass, watching her sip coffee in her car, completely unaware, smug as a queen in her tiny, icy kingdom. The first flakes began to stick to her windshield wipers as the wind picked up. I felt a thrill, a mix of adrenaline and justice. This wasn't cruelty, it was balance. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was for all the silent battles she had waged, for the tiny injustices that everyone else ignored, for the principle of my own space, my own peace. And then I saw it. The tow truck rounding the corner. Its lights cut through the gray storm, a mechanical harbinger of what was about to unfold. Karen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Her commanding eyes flicked, confused, calculating, the first crack in her perfect composure. She didn't have time to react before they were at her door, the driver stepping out like a storm incarnate. She pressed the horn, she waved, she gesticulated in her perfect, controlled way, but it was useless. By the time she realized, her car was lifted off the ground, the tires spinning helplessly in the snow, her coffee tipping, her lipstick smeared by a fleeting gust. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching her rage unfold like some cinematic climax, but I didn't gloat openly.
I didn't scream or throw snow. I simply watched, letting the storm and her hubris do all the work for me. And as the tow truck drove off, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. This wasn't about her humiliation. It was about reclaiming control, about proving that even someone reluctant like me could enforce justice without bending, pleading, or calling in rules enforcement. I was stepping into a role I never wanted, but in that frozen morning, I realized I was more capable than I had ever allowed myself to believe. And then, just when I thought the tension had ended, I saw her glance back at me through the rear window of the tow truck. Her eyes burned, not with submission, but with a cold, calculating fury that promised this wasn't over. I smiled faintly, pressing my gloves together. Let her rage, let her plot, because this time I was ready, and the storm was still raging.
I watched the tow truck disappear into the swirling gray of the blizzard, carrying her car, and with it, the illusion of her control. But the storm wasn't done. The wind howled, snow whipped sideways, and I felt a strange exhilaration. There's something about standing firm while the world rages that sharpens every sense. My heart was still pounding, but it wasn't fear. It was anticipation, that electric tingle of knowing you've taken a stand and the universe has tilted slightly in your favor. Inside, I sank into my chair, fingers wrapped around a mug of bitter coffee, staring out the frost-blurred window. My mind replayed every interaction with her, the smirks, the dismissive nods at HOA meetings, the way she always assumed I would step aside. For years, I had let her arrogance pass unnoticed, buried under polite nods and forced smiles. But this morning, in that blizzard, it hit me. No one would fight for my dignity if I didn't. No one would defend my space if I stood silent. And so, I had acted. But Karen wasn't the type to take things lying down. I knew that. Even now, as the snow fell thick and fast, I could feel the storm of her plotting forming somewhere out there in the icy white. I imagined her pacing her living room, red suit rumpled, blonde bob slightly askew, hands fisting at her sides as she tried to process what had just happened. Her cold, commanding eyes probably burned with disbelief. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to having her authority questioned, let alone being humiliated without recourse. I smirked faintly, letting the satisfaction wash over me. But I didn't relax. This was far from over. She had underestimated me, and that was my advantage. I wasn't impulsive. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't the person who called the HOA or yelled or stormed in with baseless accusations. I was strategic. I was patient. And in a blizzard, patience was a weapon. Hours passed. The storm intensified, blanketing the streets and rooftops in thick, blinding snow. I kept watch from my window, noting the faint outline of her form returning from the tow company office. No car, no triumph, only her furious glare scanning the neighborhood like a predator on high alert. She didn't know it yet, but she was trapped in a game she hadn't even realized she was playing. That evening, after the wind had died slightly but the snow remained relentless, I saw her attempt something predictable. She tried to reclaim her spot, striding across the lot with the icy authority she always carried, red heels crunching in the snow. Her expression was a mixture of indignation and disbelief, the kind that makes even the boldest person hesitate. I stayed inside, arms crossed, watching her falter as she realized the spot was empty, but more importantly, she had no car, no power, no leverage. I smirked faintly, letting the satisfaction wash over me. But I didn't relax. This was far from over. She had underestimated me, and that was my advantage. I wasn't impulsive. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't the person who called the HOA or yelled or stormed in with baseless accusations. I was strategic. I was patient. And in a blizzard, patience was a weapon. Hours stretched into night, and the blizzard turned the neighborhood into a world of white shadows and muffled sounds. I didn't sleep. I couldn't, not when Karen was out there, plotting, scheming, simmering in silent fury. I watched, waited, and prepared. Every detail mattered. The drift of snow over my cleared driveway, the angle of shadows, the way wind carried sound.
The storm wasn't just weather, it was a stage for what would come next. By midnight, the first hint of her desperation became clear. I saw movement at the edge of the lot, her silhouette hunched, pacing, muttering, hair wild from the wind, suit rumpled, shoes sliding in the snow. She was trying again, this time looking for loopholes, for any sign of weakness, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I moved deliberately, quietly, gathering the tools I needed. A shovel, yes, but also something more subtle, a psychological nudge that would make her next move her own undoing. I set small mounds of snow in strategic places, almost invisible, but enough to make her maneuver awkward. I left faint traces of cleared paths that led nowhere. Every step she took would reinforce the illusion of control before collapsing into chaos. And then I waited. Because the storm had taught me this: the snow doesn't care about authority or pride or entitlement. It only obeys patience and foresight. Karen would act, and when she did, her arrogance would ensure her downfall. By the time she made her next move, I was ready.
The storm had become a living thing by now, wind shrieking through the trees, snow drifting like ghostly curtains across the lot. I stood at my window, eyes narrowed, breath fogging the glass, watching her move again. Karen. Red suit, blonde bob now wind-tossed and wild, shoulders stiff, cold, commanding eyes blazing with fury. She had been pacing for hours, attempting to find a way back into the spot she had claimed as hers, but each time the snow thwarted her, each step a reminder that the world does not bend to arrogance. She paused, scanning the cleared driveway, then muttered to herself, a low hiss that carried over the wind, sharp and bitter. My heart thumped in anticipation. She thought she was clever, that she could outmaneuver me, but she had no idea I had been preparing for this exact moment for weeks, for her pattern of predictable entitlement. I had mapped every move she might make. She was walking into her own trap, blind to the strategy laid before her. She started forward, boots crunching in the fresh snow, carefully, too carefully. I could see her calculating, trying to be cautious, trying to avoid the little obstacles I had placed. But the snow had shifted, the drifts were uneven, and her first misstep came almost immediately. One foot slipped and she stumbled into a small mound I had left strategically. Her arms flailed and her perfectly pressed red jacket flapped like a banner of chaos. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. She recovered quickly, but her composure was cracking. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her eyes darted back toward the empty driveway, then toward me as if willing me to confess some unseen trick. I didn't move. I remained silent, letting the tension build. Every second she spent analyzing, panicking, adjusting, was a second her pride was eroding. Then, in a move that almost made me laugh, she tried to shove a snow shovel she had grabbed from the side of her house, thinking she could clear her own path. The irony was delicious. This was the same tool I had used, the same material she had underestimated. But the snow was stubborn, and the storm had turned even the simplest task into a struggle. She dug and shoveled, huffing in frustration, unaware that her every motion was being choreographed by my silent planning. Minutes passed. Then she made the final mistake. She turned to look back at me, eyes wide, fury mingled with disbelief, and stepped backward, sliding on a hidden patch of ice I had noticed earlier. Her arms flailed as she toppled backward, landing with a muffled thud in the snow. The storm swallowed her exclamation, but I could feel the tension snap. She was vulnerable. She was human. I grabbed my gloves and stepped outside, boots crunching softly, careful not to slip. The wind lashed against me, but I ignored it. I didn't need the storm to protect me now. Her own hubris had done all the work. She looked up at me, eyes blazing, mouth opening to shout, but I raised a single hand, calm and deliberate. "You're out of moves," I said quietly, letting each word settle like a weight. "This spot isn't yours to take. You've made that clear for years. But this morning, You learned something." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought she might try to fight me physically. But the storm, the snow, and her own fatigue had drained her arrogance of action. She simply glared, chest heaving, red suit now streaked with snow and sweat, blonde bobs sticking out at odd angles. She was defeated, but it wasn't me who had done it entirely. It was the snow, the planning, the patience. It was the principle that arrogance and entitlement have limits, and that some battles cannot be won with rage alone. I reached down and helped her to her feet, not out of kindness, but to assert control. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the realization that she had been outmaneuvered by someone she had underestimated. I let her feel it. Every second of struggle, every shiver, every glance at the cleared driveway reminded her that the balance had shifted. "Next time," I said, voice steady, "you'll think twice before claiming what isn't yours. And maybe," I allowed a faint smile, "you'll remember that storms don't just bring snow, they bring consequences." She said nothing, only turned and stalked back to her house, boots sinking into the deepening snow. Her car was still gone, her pride battered, and her power over the neighborhood utterly diminished. I watched her retreat, the blizzard swallowing her form, as if nature itself was echoing the lesson she had been forced to learn. I returned inside, chest still pounding, but a sense of calm finally settling over me. This was more than revenge. It was justice, executed with strategy, patience, and resolve. I didn't need the HOA, I didn't need authority, and I certainly didn't need to shout or fight. I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my peace, all in the silence of a blizzard and the certainty of planning. The storm raged outside, but inside I felt a quiet victory. I knew Karen would recover eventually. She was persistent after all. But she would never underestimate me again, not after this morning, not after the snow, not after seeing that sometimes the most powerful force isn't authority or rules. It's patience, foresight, and the courage to act when others hesitate. And as I sank into the chair by the window, watching the snow drift in endless white waves, I felt it. The relief, the satisfaction, the quiet triumph of a battle won on my terms. The storm had passed, but its lesson would linger, and so would I.